Management will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. So ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection. So ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. Chair now recognizes himself for the purposes of an opening statement. I want to thank our witnesses, Mr. Eric Hooks, the Deputy Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Mr. Chris Curry, the Director of Homeland Security and Justice for the United States Government Accountability Officer, the GAO, for being here today. Thank you for your time. I look forward to working closely with Ranking Member Titus, who is on her way, on issues critical to this subcommittee, including eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse in our federal response to disasters. Today, we will focus on FEMA's strategic plan for 2022 through 2026, which is the first strategic plan that prioritizes things like equity and climate change over actual disaster readiness and response. FEMA's core mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. The Biden administration is advancing a woke agenda focused on diversity and inclusion to the detriment of their core missions. FEMA issued a request for information in April of 2021 for feedback on how the agency's programs, regulations, and policies could better advance the goal of equity for all, environmental justice, and bolster resilience to the impacts of climate change. FEMA received 340 comments in response, and while they may have generally referenced equity, they were more focused on how FEMA could better implement their programs through technical assistance and a less burdensome application process. It is obvious to anyone who is making an honest assessment that FEMA is so focused on messaging that they are overlooking the real problem, their overly complex and bureaucratic process. Americans are also concerned about the role of FEMA playing at the southern border at the direction of the Department of Homeland Security, the direction of Secretary Mayorkas. The Homeland Security Act prohibits the diversion of FEMA assets, functions, or mission for the continuing use of any other DHS organization unless such assignments do not reduce the capability of FEMA to perform its missions. FEMA clearly has a significant capacity problem, and every diversion of resource undermines its ability to perform the core missions. GAO confirmed this capacity issue in a report released earlier this very month. The report also mentioned that in addition to responding to disasters and other emergency, FEMA was also busy assisting with Afghan refugee resettlement efforts and providing shelter and emergency supplies for unaccompanied children at the southern border. The committee has sent multiple letters inquiring about FEMA's role at the border, but we have yet to receive substantive answers to questions regarding how FEMA's deputization by the Secretary has impacted FEMA's ability to respond to disasters across the country when their staffing level is already low at 65%. Since the post-Katrina Act in 2006, there was a clear direction that FEMA would operate as a distinct entity and report directly to the President, yet it is continuously being pulled into other DHS functions regardless of capability or capacity. FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program, the EFSP, received $114 million in the supplemental appropriations for humanitarian assistance and an additional $800 million transferred from the United States Customs and Border Protection to pay for actions associated with illegal foreign national crisis at the border and beyond. How does FEMA justify allocating $332.5 million of that amount to communities to support folks who have crossed the border illegally? While FEMA regularly states that the number and intensity of disasters is steadily increasing, here it is clearly diverting resources to things outside of their mission. And I suspect, as an aside, that they're going to be coming to Congress at some point in the near future saying that they need more money to pay for disasters, when they're spending the money that they have on things other than the disasters. Today, I look forward to hearing from FEMA on their prioritization, or what I would generally characterize as a misprioritization of equity over disaster readiness and how this harms the American people. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Member Titus, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. We were in a markup in Homeland Security, which of course is tied to what some of the FEMA does with the partner agencies. I want to thank the witnesses also for joining us as we look at how FEMA is going to implement the 2022 to 2026 strategic plan. Last year at the hearing where we addressed the strategic plan, this subcommittee heard from witnesses and stakeholders about climate change, and that climate change and related severe weather events have continued to alter the emergency management landscape. Since that hearing, we have certainly seen that to be the case. Today's disasters are more frequent, they cause more damage, they are more expensive, and they take longer to recover from. My home state of Nevada has experienced the impacts of this new disaster climate. While the West still addresses the impact of drought, and this is a decades-long drought, record snowfall this year brings with it severe flooding, landslides, and mudslides across the West and in Nevada, which has resulted in a major disaster declaration at home. I'm committed to working with our governor, Governor Lombardo, and FEMA, who's on the ground there, until every eligible repair project in the state has been completed. As FEMA faces these unprecedented challenges, I particularly like to thank our Deputy Administrator Hooks and his entire team for rising to the challenges that are fueled by climate change. You've supported a nationwide disaster response and recovery efforts and simultaneously led the federal effort to respond to COVID, and that's quite a large order for you to have to meet, and we thank you for doing all that on all those different fronts. But we know that work remains to be done to find solutions to how you can administer your assistance programs. Natural disasters amplify existing disparities in our society, and the GAO has highlighted concerns with FEMA's ability to administer its programs more fairly. Time and time again, we've seen well-resourced households recover more quickly from disasters than poorer ones. If you live in an upscale neighborhood and you have the resources to move somewhere during the disaster or aftermath, you seem to get benefits and recovery efforts more quickly than if you live in the poorer neighborhoods. That's just not right that some community members can resume normal life after a few weeks or months or so after a disaster, while others are forced to live in substandard housing or sleep on the couch of a friend or neighbor for prolonged periods while they're waiting for some assistance for recovery. Recent reporting is telling us that some of these individuals and families never get back after a disaster. They're permanently displaced from their communities, and some often experience homelessness. As a result of these concerns, I introduced the Disaster Survivor Fairness Act, which includes a series of reforms designed to make federal disaster aid more easily acceptable to survivors. It removes barriers to aid by creating a universal application for federal disaster assistance, and it empowers the agency to assess home damage more fairly and more accurately post-disaster. We hope that this would ease the burden on families applying for assistance from what has been most likely the worst days of their lives. Deputy Administrator, I thank you and your colleagues again for the work you've done to guide FEMA in a positive direction, acknowledging and addressing the impacts of climate change, prioritizing equity, and investing in mitigation and resilience. Those are the kind of catchwords that we should keep in mind as we look to implement your plan. And I look forward to your testimony and Mr. Curry's in hopes that the subcommittee can better understand what we can do to help you meet the needs of people who face disasters. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the ranking member. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair and Subcommittee Ranking Member, for calling today's hearing on the impacts of FEMA's strategic plan on disaster preparedness and response. Today, we're here to discuss the challenges FEMA is facing and how meeting the goals outlined in the 2022 to 26 strategic plan will enable the agency to rise to the challenge and fulfill its mission. This conversation is critical in an ever-evolving disaster landscape fueled by climate change. Natural disasters continue to become more costly and have greater impacts upon communities across the nation. And Congress must ensure FEMA is equipped with the capacity and the resources it needs to respond. This is also a timely and important discussion for my constituents in the Washington State's 2nd Congressional District. Devastating flooding in November of 2021 and ensuing storms damaged critical infrastructure and more than 2,000 homes. Almost a year and a half later, the recovery in Whatcom County has been uneven. County officials estimate that still 100 residents lack permanent housing solutions. Some cannot figure out how to apply for assistance, others cannot get enough assistance to fully repair their homes, and some just seem to be falling through the cracks of multiple federal, state, and local programs. That's not acceptable, and I'll keep fighting for every single person in my district until they have secured permanent housing. Short and long-term challenges following a natural disaster are not confined to Washington State. In 2017 and 18, in those disaster seasons, the nationwide COVID-19 disaster declaration and last year's deadly hurricane season have all signaled the transition to a year-round disaster season, seriously straining FEMA staff and resources. Last year, Administrator Criswell reported a chilling statistic to this subcommittee. 10 years ago, FEMA managed an average of 108 disasters a year. But in 2022, that number had more than doubled, nearly tripled to 311 disasters. With a more than 50% increase in storms and disasters in the last 10 years, FEMA's strategic plan is crucial. I look forward to discussing the progress FEMA has made to incorporate climate change projections, to expand capacity, and to adapt its programs so survivors receive the quality assistance they deserve. But reforming FEMA's response and recovery programs are not enough. FEMA needs a workforce that can rise to this challenge, but that requires adequate staffing. And the GAO recently found that a 35% staffing gap exists across different positions at FEMA. And I support FEMA's efforts to recruit and retain a diverse workforce. FEMA's employees should be a reflection of the communities they serve. This won't happen by accident. Ensuring a diverse workforce and taking action to attract employees from as broad a pool of people as possible in the United States won't happen by accident, and FEMA needs a plan to do just that. Such diversity will improve the agency's understanding of the challenges faced by disaster survivors across the nation, including places like rural Mississippi, northern Alaska, Puerto Rico, New York City, and even the Puget Sound. And therefore will improve the quality of program delivery. Expanding mitigation and resilience efforts must also be at the forefront of any conversation regarding the increased frequency, intensity, and cost of natural disasters. Overwhelming evidence has proven that mitigation is a common sense, cost-effective way to save lives and to save property. That's why I strongly support expanding funding and access for mitigation and resilience projects. The bipartisan infrastructure law made great progress in making our nation more resilient by providing $5 billion for pre-disaster mitigation programs, yet more needs to be done. This includes ensuring pre-disaster mitigation grants are accessible to applicants across country and that projects selected for mitigation awards receive those funds in a timely manner. So I look forward to discussing how we can work together to drive needed reforms inside FEMA so that FEMA can fulfill its goals and its missions. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and look forward to your testimony. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. I'd like to again welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to our witnesses. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're just about out of time, and red means, wrap it up. Let's get on with it. So just, we're all operating under the same circumstance. We give you a little leeway there, but we don't want you to drone on for another 5 or 10 minutes after the red light comes on, all right? I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection. So ordered. As your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Deputy Administrator Hooks, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today. During our time together, I look forward to discussing how FEMA's strategic plan continues to guide the agency's disaster response and recovery efforts. In recent years, it has become increasingly apparent that the field of emergency management is at a pivotal moment in its history. For example, 10 years ago, FEMA managed an average of 108 disasters a year. Today, that number is 311. I can tell you that from my previous time leading the Department of Public Safety in North Carolina, that this increase in operational tempo is being felt across the emergency management enterprise. And like many of you, Administrator Criswell and I know what disasters mean from the state and local perspective. We understand that the challenges communities face are unique to them, and that it is FEMA's role to meet them where they are. Under the leadership of Administrator Criswell, FEMA released our current strategic plan in December of 2021 that has 3 cross-cutting goals. The first goal is to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. We know that there are disparities and differences in capacity, and that our programs are sometimes not easily accessible to those who need them. That is why FEMA is focused on reducing the barriers people face when accessing our programs, while also ensuring that all disaster survivors receive the assistance for which they qualify under the law. For example, we know that some homeowners in rural areas of the country have informally inherited their homes over generations. To reduce the administrative burden they faced in proving this, FEMA now accepts a broader range of ownership and occupancy documentation when applying for assistance like DMV registration or utility bills. Since FEMA has implemented these changes, tens of thousands of homeowners and renters have received our help. From families recovering from floods in Appalachia or from tornadoes in Mississippi, assistance is now flowing to those who would have previously been denied. And we've also implemented a new formula for our direct housing program based on total square feet rather than a fixed amount. This change has made it easier for people with smaller, modest homes to become eligible for direct housing. Bottom line, our priority is to make sure all survivors get the assistance for which they qualify under the law. Our second strategic goal is to lead the whole of community in climate resilience. As climate change continues to deliver frequent, intense, and complex impacts, we must apply our robust disaster response approach to disaster mitigation. And Congress's historic investment in FEMA's mitigation programs has indeed helped us become a more resilient nation. Your bipartisan support of the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, BRIC program, and the appropriation of $6.8 billion in funds to FEMA in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has provided vital funding to states, local communities, tribes, and territories seeking to reduce their risk to disasters and other natural hazards. Our third strategic goal is to promote and sustain a ready FEMA and a prepared nation. As our nation's threat landscape continues to grow and disaster seasons are turning into year-round events, FEMA must expand its approach to agency readiness and to national preparedness. For the fast-approaching 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, FEMA is taking proactive steps to make sure that we are well-postured to respond. For example, one of those steps is to strategically pre-position many more resources ahead of hurricanes. This forward-leaning posture helped us in Puerto Rico and Florida last year and will remain key to us delivering the assistance our nation needs and deserves. Finally, I can confidently say that the FEMA workforce demonstrates the very best of America and stands ready to serve those who need us most. Administrator Criswell and I are committed to supporting them in every possible way. And we ask that you continue to join us in those efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate your testimony. Next, Mr. Curry, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Titus, also Ranking Member Larson, other members of the subcommittee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about our work at FEMA. I just want to say, first of all, I think in our work, in our oversight role at GAO, I get to work, with the folks at FEMA every day, looking at what they do, traveling the country, talking to state and local emergency managers, and I have great respect for the work they do, the sacrifices they make for the country, and I think it's important to say that. I also think they have a very good culture of self-improvement and self-assessment that is important when you're trying to look at how to improve the agency. It's also why I think it's really important to honestly point to some of the challenges the agency faces. There's never been more pressure on FEMA than there is today. Since 2015, the federal government spent about $400 billion on disaster assistance, and FEMA is being asked more and more to be involved and to handle increasing national emergencies and other events. For example, they just spent over $110 billion on the COVID response, which is no one ever expected they were going to do 5 years ago. And they're being asked to do more and more. But this also takes a toll on the agency. And that's why I want to start by talking about the workforce and some of our work. As you mentioned, we just identified 2 weeks ago that FEMA was about 6,000 people short in its disaster workforce. They have a goal of about a little over 17,000, and they're 6,000 short of that goal. And they were very honest about that. It's because of burnout, the never-ending disaster season. It's tough to hire people. They're competing with other folks just like everyone else is in this country. And things like the COVID response really took a toll on the agency. So it's hard to keep up with what they need. Without a strong workforce, it's really hard to make the improvements that we all think need to be made to some of the programs, as you talked about. And that's what I also like to talk about, is some of the programs themselves. What we consistently have seen over the years in our work is that FEMA programs for disasters and survivors are way too complicated. For example, we've talked to survivors and communities that there's confusion about eligibility for programs and what steps need to be taken. Communities are frustrated by years of back and forth on complicated infrastructure projects. And I think the impact of this is not just frustration, but the impact of this is lost opportunity for recovery. Makes it very difficult for people to recover when they don't know how to navigate complicated programs. This also affects communities more that have less experience and capacity. These are really complicated programs. If you haven't gone through the process before, it's very overwhelming. And if you don't have the resources to bring in a bunch of support, it's going to be even that much harder. I'd also like to just talk about disaster recovery as a whole in this country. It's too complicated. It's fragmented across 30 different federal agencies, also over 30 different congressional committees of jurisdiction. In our work, we visit disaster locations, talk to people in your own districts, in your communities, and what we hear is very consistent, that all of these programs together for the federal government make it really hard in recovery. For example, many of them have different rules and requirements. Many of them have paperwork requirements that don't work in one program versus another, and they have different time frames as well. That makes it really hard to synchronize these programs for an effective recovery. It also makes it really hard to plan projects you want to do, maybe like mitigation projects that are really complicated if you're sitting there trying to navigate whether you can use different programs together. So that's a major area I think needs to be fixed if we're going to fix the whole disaster recovery system in this country. Now, we've made a number of recommendations in this area over the years. Almost 100 recommendations to FEMA. Many of those have been addressed. Many are still open. We also identified options that Congress and agencies can take to try to streamline these programs. For example, as was mentioned by Ms. Titus, creating a unified application process so survivors or communities don't have to go to all sorts of separate federal agencies to apply for the same types of things, and documentation can be used in different programs. You don't have to recreate that over and over again. And that's just one option. I know in the Senate today, I think the Homeland Security Committee is actually voting on a bill that would try to do that as well. There's a number of steps that can be taken, but it's a huge challenge, and that's why we actually also suggested that Congress set up an independent commission to tackle this issue, because it cuts across so many different agencies. So I look forward to the conversation today, and I appreciate the chance to be here.
Chair thanks you for your testimony, and the Chair now recognizes himself for some questioning. Director Hooks, I'm looking at, I think this is your publication, if that looks familiar to you, FEMA's Strategic Plan 2022 through 2026. And I think it's page 8 here, goals and objectives. Goal number 1, instill equity as a foundation of emergency management. Goal number 2, lead the whole of community in climate resilience. And then goal 3, promote and sustain a ready FEMA and prepared nation. Director Hooks, I'm not sure what your background is beyond emergency management. I took a look at your submittal for the record and kind of your background, but it doesn't go anything earlier in your life. I know as an Army guy, right, we have objectives, right? The big objection, of course, is to win the war, win the battle, or what have you, but then there's sub-objectives. It might be, we might list an objective like take this hilltop or something like that. And that's your focus because that's where your energies have to be applied. That's where your resources have to be applied. But there are other things that are as we would call them, implied tasks. Implied tasks. Make sure that the tank has fuel. Make sure that your soldiers get some sleep. Make sure that they're prepared and trained. Make sure that they have the equipment and the supplies necessary to engage and be successful. Those are implied tasks, but that's not the mission. The mission is to win. And it concerns me that these are your goals, 1, 2, 3, and you know, with all due respect, and we'll get into this, Mr. Curry, about the FEMA staffing issue. I'm not sure, as a person that wants to go help out in disaster relief around the country, regardless of what that disaster is, that the person that is motivated to do that is encouraged, that has the cause to do that, is going to see their first goal as your 2 first goals. They want to go get after helping people in our country that are in the perils of a disaster. And I'm taking this from the FEMA, Wednesday, May 17th. Oh, yeah, okay. Opportunities to strengthen management and address increasing challenges from Mr. Curry here. And this is a chart that's in that report that kind of outlines what citizens have to go through to avail themselves to FEMA's services. If you just look at housing, which is one of the smaller, that's this one right here. If you just look at that, and look at all the different things that a citizen has to navigate, knowing that there are, I think, 32 federal agencies and 30 different congressional committees, or maybe that's backwards, it's 30 and 32, it doesn't matter, it's a lot. Seems to me your focus should be on your mission, which is getting after disaster, and all that other stuff. Yeah, of course that comes with the program. That's assumed. Those are implied tasks. Of course we expect you to treat everybody with the same respect, regardless of where they live, what their religion is, what their color is, what their sex. We expect that as a matter of course in America. Can you speak to that? Are these your goals, or where did you come up with? How were these derived?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to respond to your question. First, thank you for your outstanding service to our nation in the military. Just a little bit about my background. I am a career law enforcement public safety professional, spending over 3 decades in North Carolina, and served as the Secretary of Public Safety. And in that portfolio was not only law enforcement, but also emergency management and approximately 13,000 National Guard troops. So my reverence for the military certainly remains high. I would say that our strategic plan in no way undercuts the mission of providing assistance to survivors and also supporting the nation before, during, and after disasters. I can draw a parallel real quickly within the time allotted in that just as as you well articulated, the mission of our military is to win any fight or project force around the world. But also there are times where things are emergent, such as suicides, that became a very much of a primary focus of reducing suicides in the military. Those are things that needed a particular focus, but they no way detracted from that overall mission. The goals in FEMA, as been articulated, and you've pointed that out in our strategic plan, also, I believe, lead us on that pathway to executing the mission that has been previously described as well. And I would also say that coming from the perspective where I come from, that these goals actually are still tied to one of the primary goals that resonate in my head from the previous administration, the previous FEMA administrator as well, to reduce the complexity of FEMA. The bottom line is that we are trying to get disaster relief to all communities that deserve that relief under the law.
Chair, thanks you for your answer, sir. And I thank you for your service as well. I appreciate the information. Chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I was talking about the inequity of the programs that some communities that are more affluent get them quicker than maybe a rural community or a poorer community, I wasn't suggesting that the policy of FEMA was to discriminate. I was talking about more systemic problems that these folks may not have the resources, they may not have the knowledge, they may not have the assistance in filing a grant application. We certainly see that in small towns in rural America. So those are the kind of things that I wanted to address, not just the attitude or values of the agency. I want to be sure I make that clear. Also, we've heard the statistic about the increase from 108 to 311 disasters over the last decade. We know, as I said in my opening statement, disasters are more frequent, they cause more damage, they're more expensive, and they take longer to recover from. I want to ask you the question in a letter recently submitted to the House Committee on Appropriations. Homeland Security indicated that the Republicans' proposed return to FY22 funding levels going backwards to cut FEMA's funding would mean cutting your assistance, your grant assistance programs in half to help state, local, tribal, territorial governments and the private sector. So instead of moving forward with the increase in problems, we want to move backwards, and that would cut that ability to assist in half. Would you elaborate on that, Mr. Hooks?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Titus. I would say that any reduction to our budget requests could have significant impacts on our ability to meet our mission requirements. Specifically, grants are often served as a very much of a capacity building mechanism within our state, local, and tribal communities. Many communities rely on those grants to build capacity because they don't otherwise have the funding from their own state legislatures or their local communities, whether or not that's an intentional decision by those local and state governments or whether they just do not have the capacity to extend that. And so it's very important that the funding requests that are made, that are contained within the President's budget with respect to FEMA and our ability to carry out our mission, are met. And I look forward to working with any member of Congress to address those critical funding needs.
Thank you. I want to ask you, too, about the workforce. We talk about it's hard to recruit, you get burned out, you're sent away from home, you don't know how long you're going to be there. It's hard work when you get there. Last Congress, we passed the CREW Act, and that was a bill that I introduced to try to extend, is it USERRA anyway, protections to FEMA reservists like you have in the National Guard, so someone can leave their job knowing that they have it to come back to after the disaster is over. Has that been in place long enough to tell if it's making a difference, or do we need to improve it in any way? Or hopefully it does give people a sense of security that may make them more inclined to do this kind of very difficult work.
Again, thank you, Ranking Member Titus, and I would like to personally thank you for your leadership in that area. You and many others have taken up the mantle, and we do believe that we will see a greater return on investment in our disaster workforce with protections that are very important. Again, I used to be the cabinet lead in North Carolina for a number of National Guard soldiers, and knowing that the value that reservists bring to a war fight, in that case, domestic deployments, is very much the same. in FEMA. In fact, our reservists are the backbone of our workforce to deploy to communities in disaster response. And so it is still a little early in the process, but as we work through our staffing levels, improve staffing levels, and promote the program with employers, just as we do with the National Guard, that there's great value in public service and service to communities, we expect great support and a great return from that investment of that legislation.
Thank you. You agree, Mr. Curry?
I agree. Anything we can do to try to make it easier for these people to be in those positions. I think the challenge for FEMA is these are part-time positions. So when you're part-time, you're gonna recruit people that are willing to take part-time work, and sometimes don't have full-time careers. So anything you can do to make it more similar to the Guard or the Reserves, and to advertise to employers that this is important federal service, not to punish them for leaving for periods of time, is a good thing.
Well, thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair thanks the ranking member. Chair now recognizes the vice chair, Ms. Chavez DeRemer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm representing Oregon's 5th District, so it's my pleasure to meet both of you as a new member of Congress. My team pulled together a couple of data points for me to discuss in relation to Oregon as it relates to this hearing. And one in particular, for the record, Mr. Chairman, a letter written from the League of Oregon Cities dated May 5th. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
So in regards to Administrator Hooks, constituents and communities in Oregon's 5th Congressional District have brought to my attention concerns about proposed changes to the National Flood Insurance Program. The League of Oregon Cities submitted comments to FEMA on May 5th, the letter I was referring to, about FEMA's work on an environmental impact statement for implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program. Specifically, these are concerns about the municipalities in current and future special flood hazard areas. Here are some of the comments from the letter. The proposed action area will have significant adverse and detrimental impacts to a cross-section of our members, including but not limited to low-income populations, land use, zoning, housing, commerce, transportation, community growth, and community infrastructure. The direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of the proposed rules will push many struggling communities further behind in their efforts to secure a stable economic future for their citizens. So additionally, the League mentions that around $23 billion in water infrastructure is already needed, and these proposed rules would place more burdens on our communities. The League states that the rules could delay 36,000 new housing units each year, and specifically a year, which were directed by executive order of the governor of the state of Oregon. So moreover, the letter states that the rules would also impact Oregon and Washington's ability to replace the I-5 bridge that is of national significance and a key transportation facility critical to interstate commerce, regional and local mobility, and national security. So, Mr. Hooks, as FEMA develops new standards for the NFIP, will FEMA take into account the concerns expressed by local stakeholders?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I certainly recognize the value and the concerns that you bring to the table with those, and some of these certainly ring pertinent with me with the I-5 bridge and some other things that you have brought up before us. Pernicious and
Specifically the
repetitive,
housing units, 36,000 housing units.
Pernicious and repetitive flooding is indeed a problem all across this country, and it impacts communities in various different ways. We do engage with stakeholders on a much more regular basis over the last few years to address those community needs out there, and we will continue to do so. Based on any particular concerns that you may have from your region, and I am more than willing to have our staff, both at headquarters and our regional staff, to sit down and discuss with any member of your team or any member of the state and local delegation that has additional concerns with that as we work through the challenges, because as I stated in my opening segment, that we recognize that weather events impact communities differently, and how we approach the recovery of those may impact them differently as well. And so look forward to learning more about the specific circumstances and look forward to being engaged with you on that.
Thank you. I'm going to switch directions just a little bit because of what we've been seeing on TV. I took a tour to the border, Arizona and Texas, and I want to ask a few questions in regards to what we're experiencing today. FEMA's current mission on the southwest border, does FEMA have the funding and personnel to carry out this mission?
Yes, ma'am. FEMA is not a border control or border patrol agency. We are a part of the flagship agency within the Department of Homeland Security. The major equity or focus that FEMA has been at the border has been congressionally directed in that we are administering the funding for humanitarian relief, and that is through our Sheltering and Services program, which is currently under development. There was legislation passed that a certain amount of money was transferred from CBP for FEMA to administer the program, and that is our major role.
Well, my time has expired. I hope my colleagues will continue to ask some line of questioning in regards to this. So thank you for your time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, and now recognize the ranking member, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator Hooks, your Region 10 folks' response in Whatcom has been great. There's just a lot of work left to do because it hit a fairly small community, fairly poor set of communities, fairly rural set of communities, and it's just taking quite a bit of work to get through there. But your Region 10 folks have been responsive. In fact, we just hosted a tabletop exercise for my staff and for some others that we brought in so that we could understand who the players were in the event of something happening in the future, doing a little bit of pre-mitigation work ourselves in preparation. So I wanted to ask a question, though, about what Administrator Criswell said in Total Appropriations Committee in April, that the Disaster Relief Fund is expected to run out of funds in July. And since learned that in June, FEMA expects to only provide funding for immediate needs so the agency can save what little money remains in the Disaster Relief Fund. And now, those are pretty troubling projections, and so can you provide an overview of the consequences if FEMA has to implement this immediate needs funding, and then why, in your view, Congress needs to get off the dime and supply the DRF with supplemental funding? My words, not yours.
Thank you, Ranking Member Larson, and thank you for your leadership in the ongoing recovery district. I have received the information from the region and how well those engagements have gone out there. FEMA has been provided significant money in its history in our DRF, but we are at a moment in time that the expenditures have outpaced the amount of funding that is in the DRF. We are now projecting that we may be able to stretch that until maybe August timeframe before the DRF would run out of funding. And so coming into the summer, if we have to go to immediate and those critical needs funding, what that would ultimately do will focus our efforts in FEMA on just life-saving, life-sustaining endeavors, which are extremely important as the priority, but that will delay mitigation and some of the recovery efforts as well. So we may have to utilize the money that's been set aside for the BRIC program to cover immediate needs for those life-saving needs around the country. So it's really critical that we get that funding stream up to where it needs to be with additional appropriations.
Is this related to the year-round disaster season issue that you've testified to?
Yes, that has been related to the op tempo that we have seen. It's also related to the amount of COVID bills that are coming in, and that does remind me one of the other impacts that could be delayed is reimbursement to hospitals around the nation for their COVID expenses too. Those could be delayed if we are lacking funding coming into the summer. So.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I have one more question, but I don't have a question on the emergency food and shelter program, but I've been at facilities in a few cities in Texas who are using those dollars, and in my view, it's a very effective use of those dollars to ensure migrants aren't on the streets of these cities, but actually are getting in touch with their sponsors, getting help they need so they can get and move on to where their sponsors are in the country. And so to the extent that the EFSP is being used and being used well, it's providing relief to those cities to allow them to do their part and get these folks who are migrants to get the places they need to get to as we want them to. On BRIC, you mentioned BRIC, investments in mitigation certainly help our communities deal with the impacts of natural disasters. $1 mitigation pre-disaster can yield up to 13 in savings, so BRIC program is extremely helpful. It's been 3 years since we made the first round of selections for BRIC, and we've done 2 more rounds. Do you have some lessons for us other than it's so successful that we might use it to backfill a different program because it's being overused? Do you have some lessons on the BRIC program for us?
Yes, sir. It is my belief that the BRIC program can be very transformative to communities, but what it requires is not just FEMA working in that mission space. What it requires are state and local communities being well-versed into all of the federal programs so that they can learn to sequence and combine dollars to build more resilient communities. The idea of BRIC is not only to just rebuild after a disaster, but is to mitigate against future disasters, therefore making us a more resilient nation, and also, and this phrase has been said by the president many times, to build back better, and that does make us a more resilient nation.
I appreciate that, and seems to fit your goal too, and with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to do a couple follow-ups on Chairman Perry's questions. Mr. Hooks, in your professional opinion, does a hurricane, tornado, earthquake, or flood care if an American is Black, Latino, Indigenous, Asian, or Pacific Islander, another person of color, members of a religious minority, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, or a person with a disability or a person living in a rural area, or a person who is otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality?
Thank you for the question. As I understood it, because there was a long list of there that was provided.
It's from your priorities, sir.
Okay.
I didn't write that list, you did.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just wasn't.
I did not write that list, you did. That's your number one priority. Okay, so with that list in mind, are your programs available to a middle-class Caucasian living in a city?
Absolutely. My reference was just my inability to hear you, sir,
Okay.
not taking any issue at what you said.
Well, I got to tell you this, man. Hey, listen.
Okay.
Those 2 questions are intentionally absurd, as I think your priorities are with your strategic plan. And this is why. The Homeland Security Act of 2022 states very clearly that FEMA's mission is to reduce the loss of life and property and protect the nation from hazards by leading and supporting the nation in a comprehensive risk-based emergency management program. So that's your charter from Homeland Security. And yet your 3rd priority is making sure FEMA is ready to go. Your first priority is to have this list of folks here, and apparently they're supposed to take precedence over other people. Now, I am sure that you are not implying by putting this list that you have baked some type of discriminatory practices into your agency. What I'm telling you is this: if an average person were to pick this up, that's their immediate assumption. So I really believe that you need to rethink your priorities and how they are listed. I'd like to move on to something else. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'd like to have 2 letters entered into the record. One is from us going to the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Ford Motor Company, reference AM radios.
Without objection.
And one from the National Association of Farm Broadcasters, reference AM radios.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Hooks, AM radio has about 45 million listeners each month, and my constituents rely on this for emergency alerts, local news and information and weather. In the case of natural disasters, tornadoes, floods, wildfires, and other local emergencies, AM radio is our lifeline in the rural community. And according to FEMA, 75 radio stations, most of which operate in the AM band and cover at least 90% of the U.S. population, are equipped with backup communications equipment and generators that allow them to continue broadcasting information to the public during and after an emergency. Most importantly, AM radio is free to all Americans, not requiring a subscription or a broadband connection. So, Mr. Hooks, in your professional opinion, is the apparent move from the civilian commercial manufacturing sector, move away from AM radios, going to affect your ability to communicate in an effective manner to the vast majority of the American population in the case of an emergency?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that important question, and it actually relates a little bit back to the equity question, which is the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals. And with that in mind, the use of AM radio is critically important to our ability for emergency managers and first responders and local communities to commit to inform and advise their communities to where the danger is coming from, how to evacuate, and how to stay out of harm's way. And so I fully support the recommendations that are moving forward to support the continued use of AM radio. That is a tremendous format by which we reach millions of Americans in times of need, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hooks. I'm going to have my folks send this letter over to your office so you can review this, and I would appreciate your direct support on these types of initiatives.
Thank you, sir.
Very well. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Representative Davids.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses being here today. And Deputy Administrator Hooks, I do want to extend a special thank you to you and all the employees at FEMA. I know the work that you all do is really, really important, and it helps the folks who are impacted by the disasters that we've been talking about today. It's very, very important service, so thank you for that. And my question is really for either witness that wants to share an opinion on this, but I am definitely particularly interested in hearing from Deputy Administrator Hooks on this. I represent a district in Kansas that we have our fair share of experiences with natural disasters like tornadoes and flooding and that sort of thing. And like the rest of the country, we saw a pretty big fallout from COVID. And, during the course of the pandemic, there were a lot of systemic vulnerabilities that we saw. One of the things that ended up happening in the 3rd District is a company that has experience making PPE, Dentec, in my district sought to pivot to making N95 masks to help backfill the national stockpile needs that we saw. But they had been previously priced out of the market, and there was, through a lot of effort and some limited support that the federal government was able to provide, they were able to retool and expand to produce some of those critical supplies immediately and to be able to do that domestically. I know in 2018, this was referenced earlier, U.S. hospitals faced widespread shortages of IV bags in the wake of Hurricane Maria, which damaged and temporarily shut down several Puerto Rico factories that were the manufacturers of those bags. So, when tragedy hits, our first priority is obviously the safety of people and the provision of emergency services, which is exactly what you all do. But there's also so many examples of ways that we need to maintain infrastructure, supply chains that are critical for addressing those needs. I'm right now in the early stages of drafting a bill that I hope I'll be able to introduce soon to empower the Economic Development Administration, which is also under the purview of this subcommittee, to stand up a pilot program that would help make grants available in the wake of these kind of disasters for production of those supply chains that are impacted for critical resources and that sort of thing. You started to talk a little bit about the interagency working with communities, but I'm particularly interested in the coordination of those wraparound services that exist as part of FEMA's strategic plan, specifically in the readiness goal that you all have laid out. Can you talk a little bit about that interagency coordination that takes place before, during, and in the aftermath of one of these disasters?
Thank you for the question, and I would say that FEMA looks forward to working with you and your staff and any of the committee staff on any initiatives that would drive us forward to being a more resilient nation. It is critically important that FEMA work on, and there are sometimes very few of these blue sky days across the interagency to figure out where all of the authorities lie and how we can best leverage the authorities, not just within FEMA, but across all sectors of the federal government to support our local communities. We learned a lot of lessons during COVID-19, and some of them some very hard lessons as well. And one of those was that the supply chain could be greatly impacted by a worldwide pandemic and other issues that we could think through as well. And I know that while I was serving in North Carolina, just as many other states, the critical need for PPE came to the forefront as it was brought to us by health officials and the hospitals as well. And so every state ended up trying to buy up as much as they can, and we were competing against each other, and sometimes that created great difficulty. So there are a lot of lessons learned about how we can coordinate and how we can, utilize PPE and other resources and shared resources in a degraded environment, so to speak, or which supply chains are limited. Also, we are always looking in part of our readiness, both for our employees and into communities, to educate about mental health, about those those services that are available within FEMA for our own employees to support their own mental health, because sometimes they will carry the burden of those disaster survivors that they are working to serve. And then also, as part of our community readiness, we challenge communities as well as educate communities, not only to the things that they need to have to respond to a disaster event, but to recognize the real impacts of those events as well. So it's important to engage health and human services and mental health agencies to get those response needs out to disaster survivors.
Thank you so much. And we'll follow up with additional questions about the lessons learned. And yield back, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank the representatives. Turn now to Representative Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to our witnesses for being here today. A situation that my district has faced is that in August 2021, Tropical Storm Fred devastated western North Carolina, particularly a very small rural mountain community, happens to be my hometown, destroying homes, washing away an entire season worth of crops and closing businesses for days and weeks at a time. The effects of that storm are still today plaguing communities in this district, like Haywood County, who on top of disaster response are now fighting to mitigate the impacts of their community's economic closing of a paper mill back at home. And in the aftermath of Tropical Storm Fred, citizens of western North Carolina who applied for FEMA funds complained to me that the process was overly complicated. They had to have access to a computer. Now, mind you, many of them didn't have homes or electricity or access to internet, which are luxuries that are available, not available in the aftermath of a disaster. They had to seek out FEMA, and then FEMA provided checks for, in many cases, unfair assessments. One resident was provided just $312 from FEMA to repair more than $10,000 in home damage. So my first question, Mr. Hooks, is do you think $312 in disaster assistance for a $10,000 repair is fair?
Thank you, Congressman Edwards. And sir,
Can't hear.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Congressman Edwards, and thank you for the question. I would say overall that to your specific question, if there are needs that far exceed what FEMA is going to provide, there needs to be a larger discussion. FEMA recovery funds are meant to jumpstart a recovery. They typically are not through congressional authorization designed to make a person whole, unfortunately. And I have lived this right there in North Carolina. But if there are any particular cases that you have in your community where the amount of reimbursement has not met the needs, those need to be important and tough conversations that need to be had both at the state level, and I am very familiar with your Emergency Management Director, Will Ray, as his predecessor, Mike Sprayberry, and I both served in the state of North Carolina and with Will prior to me retiring from the state. And so we look to impact communities and we look to hear where disaster recovery falls short. And so, you know, again, federal funds by congressional appropriation and direction are not meant to fully make them whole, and that's why there is needs to be great commitments in the local community and in state legislatures. And I did find that during my time there that there were supportive individuals both in the executive branch of the governor's office as well as in the legislature who focused on disaster relief, but any particular concerns with constituencies be willing to work with you.
Okay, thank you. So that I can get in my next question, Mr. Hooks, can you tell us what steps might FEMA be taking to help the application process as I described a while ago, where so many folks in my district had difficulty making an application without electricity and internet, or even a place to store a computer?
Yes, sir, very important question. And that is where, at the beginning of my testimony, where I talked about how equity actually drives our response. Because there's a recognition that many communities, rural communities, don't have broadband. Some people don't even have access to the internet or a computer at the time of disaster. And so in order to meet those individuals where they are at the times of disaster, both FEMA and the local responders, EMS, not just EMS, but local emergency management and state emergency management need to be out in communities. What FEMA is doing in our forward-leaning posture is going out into those communities, holding town halls, registering people with through our own paper process and through our own computers that may not have access to those resources. And we are moving forward, and I believe smartly, in doing so into this hurricane season. We saw the benefit of that. I saw the benefit of that directly in Florida when I went down after Hurricane Ian to get out in those communities, meeting people in their homes, in their churches, in their communities, because there's a false assumption if anybody believes that people can just get online and register for the programs. And we are endeavoring to reduce the complexity of those programs as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hooks. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Now, for her 5 minutes, Ms. Norton Holmes.
Thank you. Deputy Administrator Hooks, one of the stated goals of FEMA's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan is to, and I'm quoting, instill equity as a foundation of emergency management, end quote, so that no person or community gets left behind. As of last year, FEMA did not collect data on racial demographics when assessing potential barriers to assessing disaster relief. Because FEMA does not collect this data, the GAO cannot fully analyze the potential racially disparate allocation of FEMA assistance. So, sir, may I ask you, does FEMA have plans to collect information on racial demographics going forward?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. FEMA does collect information, but that's strictly collected on a voluntary basis. We collect and analyze demographic data based on protected characteristics that are listed within the Stafford Act. So we do not go outside of our authorities that are listed, enumerated in the Stafford acts. And so while we are endeavoring to instill equity as a foundation of emergency management, those focus on communities that have often that have a lack of capacity. And ultimately, our goal is to provide a consistent and fair and just impartial treatment to all individuals as we pursue equity as a part of our strategic goal.
So you collect it on a voluntary basis. Can you collect it more rigorously than that?
It is collected in accordance and analyzed within the confines of the Stafford Act itself, and they are enumerated in the Stafford Act. Under the Stafford Act, and particularly in Section 308, we are charged with administering our programs in an equitable manner. And this is one of our highest priorities. We are not operating outside the authority that's within the Stafford Act. And this is an important aspect of the work that we're doing and therefore the goal of equity is a pillar of our work moving forward and will remain.
Well, with the average number of climate disasters on the rise, it becomes important to invest before a disaster in resilient infrastructure that can withstand disasters. However, many disadvantaged communities often lack the staffing, resources, and expertise to sufficiently address complex application requirements for pre-disaster mitigation grants. So, Mr. Hooks, has FEMA considered allowing nonprofits to submit applications for pre-disaster mitigation protects that benefit underserved communities, which they are permitted to do for post-disaster mitigation projects?
Ma'am, the programs that are prescribed under law for us require us to go through certain avenues, and those are through the local governments that are established. So that could be the state administrative agent, or I happen to serve in that capacity in North Carolina prior to coming to FEMA. So those hazard mitigation funds, they have to flow through that state administrative agent based on the direction that we have from Congress at Bear. I do hear the need, and so one of the things that we can do, even within the structures of those environments, is that we can draw a greater nexus by bringing state administrative agents, emergency managers, and nonprofit organizations to the table for those discussions as to how those hazard mitigation projects could potentially unfold to benefit those underserved communities and to build capacity in those communities.
Well, I see my time has expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Horton. Now with his 5 minutes, Mr. Essel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Deputy Administrator Hooks, you mentioned that one of your goals is to create equity through FEMA's strategic plan. Well, BRIC's application requirements and scoring criteria appear to create the opposite for my district. For example, 25%, the 25% local match requirements are already too burdensome for many communities in South Mississippi. Yet BRIC applicants receive extra points for providing a 30% match. To me, it seems like this rewards communities that have more access, more resources. Can you explain what work FEMA has done to balance the equity with the BRIC's program weighting in its strategic plan?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. One of the larger discussions that we must continue to have is not only with those local communities, but how the state views those local communities as well, because the money from BRIC would flow through the state of Mississippi as those project plans are developed. And so And every state is different. There are some states that cover the full cost share. There are some states that do not. And so that lends itself to a greater discussion at the state and local level as to which projects could be funded under BRIC. One of the ways that we believe that we can advance the capacity for local communities to participate in all of our programs is through direct technical assistance to either local communities or through the state to sit down, to discuss, to learn about the threat hazards in a particular community, to learn about what are potential mitigation projects, and to help them have a pathway to development, to developing those projects. We can't design those individual projects for them because, I won't say unfortunately, but the way it is designed is a competitive grant process that's always going to be oversubscribed. And so, but we can provide them some of the basics that through webinars, seminars, and meeting individuals in their community to help build that capacity. And we can do that through direct technical assistance on individual programs. We also endeavor to do that through our FEMA integration teams, which are FEMA employees that are situated within the state that can go out along with those state emergency management directors and their programs to meet with local communities, understand their hazards, and address their mitigation response.
Thank you. I also want to address some complaints I received from my communities regarding FEMA delaying reimbursements. As you know, Mississippi's electric cooperatives and local officials depend on FEMA's public assistance program to help restore power after natural disasters such as hurricanes. Given the complaints from stakeholders, can you comment on the issue of delayed reimbursements?
Well, I would say generally that I recognize that disaster assistance never comes fast enough, both for individuals that have suffered through storms and natural disasters and for communities trying to recover from them. And so we are endeavoring to work specifically with those stakeholders and those communities to expedite disaster assistance where we have. Again, recognizing that federal government programs are generally complex, and so to help them navigate to them, we have adopted a more forward-leaning posture of providing direct technical assistance to that. And I say that as no excuse for any delays, because we all feel that across the emergency management enterprise, and we want to be able to get those congressionally appropriated dollars out to those communities and to those localities that deserve that assistance under the law.
They are very complex, and when you're without power and water and ice and things such as that, and life is miserable, sometimes, we need to do better. All of us need to do better, but I tell you, there's so much red tape when it comes to getting our money back or getting things done that could be easily done. Some of this red tape needs to be removed, and I would ask that you would do your due diligence in helping us, especially in South Mississippi where we are rural and we need help sometimes in like I say, when you're out of water, when you're out of opportunity there, we need your help.
Yes.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you to the gentleman. This time, we're going to have Ms. Napolitano for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Administrator Hooks and Mr. Curry, I represent arid eastern Los Angeles County with major flood control systems along the rivers San Gabriel and Rio Hondo, with multiple dams and miles of flood control channels. Our region is arid and normally dry, and most of our residents forget they do live in a flood-prone region. This winter of very heavy storms have been managed very well, and we have not had any major flooding, but a historic storm could flood parts of Southern California. How does FEMA educate and inform constituents, such as mine, that live in arid regions of plausible flood risk, their flood zone information, and obtain flood insurance? Which medias do you use?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congresswoman, and certainly recognize that because of the impacts of fire in your district and in other places around the country, that debris, ash, and fire can form mud flows, and flooding is also a pernicious threat to those communities as well. You know, one of the things that we certainly can do is to hold additional meetings, seminars, and opportunities for engagement, not only with the state at the at that level, but within local communities. And so we really need to consider even more leaning forward into how we can support those communities by holding those meetings where we can hold listening sessions too, because I think there's great value in listening too, and also educating those communities. We have had hundreds of engagements around the country around what the flood risks are for individuals and how to protect against those things, and discussions around the importance and the value of insurance.
What media do you use to get the word across?
Yeah. They come across in a number of ways. Sometimes they are in-person meetings. I think those will increase, as we are coming through the pandemic. There are also webinars and workshops and trainings that are available to communities. And one of the things that I believe that we are and should be is a learning and growing agency, and so we should be taking input back from not just those states, but those local communities as to how we can reach them more directly, not bypassing the state, because they are an integral part of disaster relief, and they have to take the lead in those mitigation dollars that flow through their state.
We have 3 councils of government that encompass 87 of the LA County cities that meet together, and I would offer you meeting with them, because that covers all those cities, and they'd be able to get the information to the city direct without having to go to each city individually. Also, Mr. Curry?
Yeah, so in the flooding situation in Southern California, by the way, I think is a perfect example of an unexpected event of flooding when people never expected to have flooding. So it's also a community that has not been prepared for this type of event. They were more prepared for earthquakes and droughts and things like this. So I agree with you. It's very important that FEMA work with them on pre-disaster mitigation and planning too, especially now that they know that's a risk, and maybe possibility through the BRIC program and things like that of how we can divert some of those floodwaters in the future now that we know it's a risk.
Well, the communities have done very well for themselves. They've been managed to avoid any heavy damage, but there is certain concern about the debris basins. Also, in your testimony, Mr. Hooks, the average number of disasters FEMA manages increased, but how can you speak on the mental health of your staff? How do you often treat them for the burnout? Because last time I heard FEMA talk, you had a problem with your membership going to another one right after an event, didn't want to travel.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Again, our operational tempo at FEMA is extremely high, and so the most valuable commodity that FEMA has is the staff, and those just aren't words. And so we have to make greater investments. And as we recognize that May is Mental Health Awareness Month, it is an opportunity for us to double down and focus on the mental health of our public safety professionals, which FEMA employees are part of that. And so they take on oftentimes the heavy burdens that communities face.
What services does FEMA offer them?
FEMA, through our employees, we offer webinars, workshops, and trainings. We're having those not just this month, but those are ongoing. We are growing our ability to support our personnel through our through our mission support functions. We have brought on a psychologist who leads a team of support.
One psychologist?
We have a psychologist at this point, but at the ability to contract with other professionals to support that endeavor, and that is a way of growing in our movement forward to support our own workforce.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll talk to you later. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Napolitano. At this time, we're going to have Mr. Exposito for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for attending today's hearing. I have spent my adult life in emergency management, serving as a 23-year member of the Island Park Fire Department, serving as chief there from 2009 to 2016. I'm also a retired NYPD detective and now have the honor to serve on the Homeland Security Committee as chair of Emergency Management and Technology. The DHS plays a near and dear role in the hearts of New Yorkers and many of the communities that I represent, from 9/11 recovery to the hardworking inspectors at our ports to obviously disaster mitigation. I was the incident commander in Island Park, which was one of the hardest hit communities probably in New York during Sandy. And I know emergency management and structural resiliency are family table issues for many Long Islanders. Mr. Hook, the ever-expanding of FEMA's scope has directly led to the hemorrhaging of taxpayer dollars in order to bear the burden of Biden's humanitarian crisis at our borders, both the southern and northern. What is the administration's plan to address the financial challenges that jeopardize FEMA's strategic plan?
Well, sir, as I testified earlier today, that the role that FEMA has in supporting on the southwest border is one of setting up and administering the Shelter and Services Program that was congressionally directed for $800 million to be moved from CBP budget to set up that program so that that money is dispersed to localities and nonprofit organizations for humanitarian relief. As far as our numbers, the numbers of individuals that have supported operations has actually been really small. And so I would say to you that across the many myriad of challenges that we face in emergency management and homeland security, and thank you for your great service in the past, and as you continue to serve in this new capacity, that the state of FEMA is strong and that we are ready to support the nation. There are no doubt that we have challenges before us, and they are brought to bear because of the various threats that our nation faces, the operational tempo and the number of weather events that we have, and then also just the lack of availability of a qualified workforce to draw upon. And so we are working in all of those areas to support the nation. And I'm still heartened by the commitment of those individuals that do serve. And as you know, that they don't get to go home when everybody else goes home, that commitment will continue.
Thank you. As the disaster relief fund continues to dwindle to inadequate levels, what is the plan to protect vulnerable coastal communities like Long Island?
Well, that is one of the reasons that I believe that very strongly that we need to constantly monitor the use of the disaster relief fund. We are projecting a shortfall coming by the end of the summer, and so that is why we are working within the administration, and we'll be working with members of Congress for any funding requests that need to be met so that we can meet the mission across the nation, and that includes flooding and other issues that you may face in your district.
Thank you, because that mission is important because people's lives and livelihoods depend on it.
Yes, absolutely. I believe that our greatest mission is the preservation and sustainment of life, and you're absolutely correct.
Thank you. Mr. Curry, as the GAO reported, there is dead weight within FEMA that hinders the agency's success, which ultimately harms the American people and those that are in need. Do you believe that expanding the scope of FEMA's oversight to include humanitarian relief to those who try to illegally cross our borders has put the American people and those in need of FEMA's original mission at a disadvantage?
Sir, I mean, what we've looked at is the ever-expanding scope of FEMA's mission, not just at the border, but it was mentioned settling Afghan refugees, the COVID pandemic, and it's having a huge toll on the agency. There's 6,000 people short in their disaster workforce, and they're having trouble keeping a lot of the people they already have.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Desposito. Now I'm gonna do my 5 minutes. I know I'll be doing more than that, but I'll surely put some of those questions on the record. First of all, thank you for being with us today and coming from an island of Puerto Rico where we did have Hurricane Irma and Maria and a lot of flooding during the last years. We're still in the recovery process, and I want to say thank you to the FEMA, HUD, and all emergency personnel that are still on the island dealing with many of those issues. I know the chairman actually did some questions, and one of those was regarding the report from General Accounting Office about all the agencies that needs to fill some forms even before some assistance can be given. And he should show at the page 11 of that report today. And one of my questions should be, should Congress specifically legislate that the federal level institute a one-stop-shop disaster recovery model so that all the information is gathered once and shared widely with the agencies?
Thank you for the question, Madam Chair. I am a firm believer that the more the interagency can work together to reduce the complexity of recovery and response and recovery to disaster is going to benefit our communities, ultimately save lives, and then lead to a more robust and quicker recovery. We are right now working with HUD and other agencies about the response and immediate recovery actions. And so, you know, the more we can reduce complexity, and there are challenges with that.
So the answer is yes.
It may be a little bit more nuanced than just yes for a one-stop shop, every, you know, recovery agency or something like that. So that's why I add a few qualifiers around it, but trying to be responsive to your question.
Thank you. One thing that we always ask about very anxiously by my municipalities, NGOs, constituents, local agencies back home is the possibility of approved funding having to be forgone or being taken away. So my question would be, are there any FEMA funds for Puerto Rico at this time at risk of being lost or repurposed due to the deadline expirations, budgetary clawbacks, non-completion of stages of work that was programmed, or other reason for the rest of the 2023 or 2024?
We are working, you know, extremely well, I believe, with Puerto Rico in a number of ways.
Is it yes or no?
Yes or no to which part, madam?
Of any money that can be forgone or clawback or repurposed? Because because any deadline is not being completed. If you don't have, of course, we're talking about a lot of fundings in different areas. I will be happy to provide you with time so we can have a breakdown or chart or spreadsheet of such funds that may be and how much may be forgone or be taken away.
All right. Based on the information that I have before me, if we're referring to the shortfalls that we see in the disaster relief fund for 2023, we are not looking at clawbacks for them. What we are looking for is to fully fund the disaster relief fund so that we do not have delays in some of those mitigation and recovery efforts.
The reason I asked that question is because I know the government of Puerto Rico is asking for extending waivers for the use of mitigation funds and federal funds in many of those areas. And I don't want to see the government of Puerto Rico returning a lot of this funding because it's not being used or because they're not fulfilling any deadline that has been imposed by any federal agency. So the answer is no?
I clearly understand, a little bit more clearly understand what you're getting at. The time frame by which you describe it, I'm not quite sure. I do not see an immediate clawback of money from Puerto Rico.
Let's do something. If there's something in 2023 or 2024 that could be forgone or there's a deadline for the use of those funds, and in the case of not using them, it's going to return to the U.S. government, can you make that list and submit it to the committee?
What I can do, ma'am, is that I can make sure that staff work with you and the government of Puerto Rico on any particular concerns of any money being clawed back, due to lack of execution. We recognize that that waivers and extensions have been granted. A lot of that has been because of supply chain, which we've talked about earlier in this committee, and just building capacity across the nation to address those recovery efforts.
And that includes inflation and some projects that were estimated with some amount of funds, and now the projects are going to be needing more funds and you don't have it. So that can be included there?
It could, ma'am.
I know my time has expired, but I will submit some questions for the record. Now allow Mr. Rouser for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the panel being here today. In North Carolina, we've experienced our fair share of hurricanes over the years. If you can describe, just for the record, if you take a minute, just describe, let's say a hurricane's barreling down on the coast of North Carolina. You do preparatory work, et cetera. Talk about that process real quick, if you can, for about a minute. And let's assume that you have the money that you need in the Disaster Relief Fund.
Yeah. Thank you, Congressman Rouser, and certainly good to see you. And I recognize the fact that you are here and have served out there in the EOC at North Carolina when we have faced that exact circumstance. Both FEMA and states that have experience in dealing with those response mode want to be forward-leaning in the response to those hurricane events that come down. So there are notifications that need to be made. So that's where it comes back to some of the earlier testimony, the importance of being able to notify the citizens across a broad array of communication systems to include AM radio. That we also advance advisories out there as to whether or not there is recommendations for evacuation and how to and the supplies and things that you need in the immediate aftermath of the storm. Assets are pre-positioned. Both state, local, and federal assets are pre-positioned just outside of where we believe the landing area may be for those hurricanes, and then immediately upon the impact and when it's safe to do so, you will see first responders going into those communities as well. One of the things that we are doing even more so now in FEMA is that we are encouraging people to go ahead, whether they believe they have insurance or their insurance is not going to cover that, is to have teams on the ground, both not only for commodities and supplies that will flow and are often delivered by military and first responder personnel and state emergency management, but also FEMA personnel on the ground too, to get to, as soon as possible, get people registered for individual assistance and to work with those communities. We are also leveraging technology in a more forward-leaning posture as well. The use of GIS, spatial and technology, allows us to use technology to do damage assessments much quicker, hopefully in terms of damage in a matter of days versus weeks, and that will help jumpstart the recovery.
If I can cut you right there, because I got about 2:05 left, and I want to get all this in. FEMA does, in my opinion, a very, very good job up front in terms of response and saving lives. I can tell you from my personal experience, one of my frustrations as a member of Congress is hurricane comes through, you have all this damage, you know what your needs are, Congress passes an appropriations bill. We put in a significant amount of money for the CDBG-DR program, disaster recovery program, and then it takes 3, 4, or 5 years for any money to go out the door. And in the meantime, another member of Congress has had a storm in their district and they take all my money. Well, we know how that works. So I've got a bill to help correct this. It's the Natural Disaster Recovery Program Act, and basically what it does, forget everything anybody knows about CDBG-DR. It puts in place a true block grant facilitated through FEMA, where you take the unmet need, Congress appropriates the money, Congress appropriates 50% of the money up front that goes to the states. If that is used appropriately and that's verified by an audit by the state, whether it's state auditor or whoever, reports back to the appropriations committees and the committees of authorization, that checks out, they get the other 50%. It's immediate. Rather than all this finger pointing between the state and the federal government about, oh, you know, you got to have this work plan, et cetera. It's got to be approved at HUD. You have all kinds of miscommunication, and it just takes forever. I have victims from Hurricane Florence, still have no help, recovery help. And so anyhow, personally, I think simple is better. Simple is easy to implement. Simple is easy to enforce. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, sir. I am an advocate of breaking down the complexity of the programs in the federal government. Having that experience coming from your home state as well, I have actually lived through some of the frustrations of the immediate recovery response, transitioning over to community block development, disaster relief grant funding as well, and having to navigate all of those. And I would offer our staff to work with your staff and any member of the committee here on how we can move forward smartly to reduce the complexity of accessing programs in the federal government and also being good stewards of the taxpayers' dollars.
Thank you. I really appreciate your both of you being here today. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. Thank you, witnesses. And are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today, and I would like to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony today. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objections, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. That the subcommittee stand adjourned.